right, everyone. Thank you for coming to my presentation today at JCON. I'm really feel honored to be here today. And a big special thank you to our sponsors that have made this possible. You can see them all listed here. Today in this talk, I'm going to be discussing flexible APIs with Spring HATEOAS. So before we get started, just a quick introduction about who am I. My name is Greg Turnquist. I happen to have written a book this past year called Hacking with Spring Boot 2.3 and its reactive edition and its companion volume, Hacking with Spring Boot 2.4 Classic Edition, which you can check out perhaps later after the conference. I've got the box in my way here. Let me move this over to here. I'm a principal developer on the Spring team at VMware. I am a co-founder of the Nashville Java user group over in the United States. And I'm the creator of the YouTube channel Spring Boot Learning, the channel where you learn about Spring Boot and you have fun doing it. And today, why don't we talk about APIs? So what exactly is an API? Let me get this. There we go. Okay, I've got the thumbnail pictures of everybody here in my way. Okay. So what is an API? What can we expect from that? Just a second, I'm there. Okay. Is it a place you go to get maybe a little JSON, maybe a little XML? Maybe there's somebody out there that are still having to dabble with XML, or get whatever. Maybe you're fetching video or something like that, but you access an API to go get that content. Is it a way to interact with the application that you're reaching? Maybe it's the means to extract value from another app that helps out your own app. This could be a mashup situation. Perhaps you're running a fleet of microservices that need to interact with each other, run by different teams. Whatever it is, we're going to dig in and discover what it means to have a flexible API. Now let's start off with a little bit of code here. Some of you may be familiar with Spring MVC, and this is basically a kind of a boilerplate Spring MVC web controller method. It's very simple. There's a nice clear separation, and you can highlight here what the components are. You know, we have our declaration of the URI that this web method will respond to. In this case, a /API/employees with a templated variable here, and it responds to HTTP GET calls. We're able to extract what the key context here is from this, the path variable that we're looking into. And then we're able to connect with a backend service that we have that's able to fetch that, whether that's a repository, a more detailed service, whatever it is, we can go find out what this employee object is and hand back what I'm going to call basic employee. Maybe when you build a real production system, you don't actually call it basic employee, but we're going to show some evolution of building a more flexible API in this talk. And in this case, we're going to start off with a very basic employee structure. Now, in your simple API, maybe you can expect to get back a little bit of data. What if this API had to do with our payroll system and the teammates that we have include Frodo from Lord of the Rings, and every payroll system, we have an identifier for the person, a primary key. We have a name attribute. Perhaps they have a role within our enterprise. In this case, Frodo's our illustrious ring bearer. So what can we get out of this API? Well, we can get some data and really nothing else. There's really very little else served up in this format. There's some value in that. Maybe if you're trying to extract value out of this API, you can get some amount of value, but what about updates? What if you needed to make alterations, for example, to this API, or changes are coming down the line? What happens? How do we cope with things like breaking changes? Or what about things like backwards compatibility? What if you're not the only consumer of this API? What if there's lots of different tools that are consuming this API and they all need to deal with breaking changes that come down the pipeline from the provider of this API? How do we cope with that? And as a cliched maybe example of oversimplified one that's actually very realistic is you've built this startup company off a basic employee record. And as soon as you got successful and got your 1,000th customer using the system, your manager walks into your office and says, okay, we need to update the API. We started with name, but it's not sophisticated enough. So we need to come up with a more advanced solution. So we want to break that name up into first name and last name. Maybe that's a contrived example, but I'm sure many of you in the audience can relate to having these kind of changes show up at the worst possible moment, where it's like, oh, we need to change this column into 2 columns. So maybe you just hurriedly go through, okay, I'll just change. You told me to change it. I'll go make the change. Let's go apply the thing. And then I'm going to start serving up this data. So now I have the same ID value I always had, but I have the first name Frodo, last name Baggins, role ring bearer. Okay, that's fine. What can be the harm in that? Well, the problem comes if there's older clients that haven't caught up to that yet. What happens when somebody issues the equivalent? Maybe your clients that are consuming the API don't use curl, but in this example, what if they try to post and they haven't updated to the API and they try to use the old name field, and they're trying to add a new member to the staff, Samwise Gamgee, the gardener. Well, you've got some options to debate. What are you going to do with that? You could just tell them to deal with it. Hey, you need to use the new API. You need to upgrade. It's time to get with the program. Another option is you could roll out another version. You could keep the old version of the API running, and you could put out, V2 version 2. Put that version out there. Or a third option is you could update your API to actually handle both formats. You could, instead of making it a breaking change, you could provide backwards compatibility by handling either name or the first name last name combination. Now, all of these, I can imagine you're thinking, gee, that's a lot of there's a lot of options, and what's the trade-offs? What are the cost benefits for doing that? And any software engineering solution, we need some analysis here. So it may surprise you, but somebody already went and did a study. This was it used to be an InfoQ article back in 2013, but it actually, somebody analyzed the cost of API versioning. And there's 3 principal lines on this. The one at the top is the not version, is called the not version. This is where you maintain one version of the API. You put out an update and you tell everybody to catch up to it. And at the top, the API in this study, the API grew at a certain pace, but at the breaking point, the cost of change became unbearable. There was too much outside pressure. There was internal pressures. There was a lot of factors that came in, and thus any more changes, the ability to make changes slowed drastically, and every change became tactical. It became how critical. Only for the most critical changes would they make updates. Now, the line in the middle, the red one, the point-to-point one, is when you run multiple versions. You have V1, V2, and before you know it, you're up to V58. I don't know. That was able to better cope with that, but there was still a rise in cost as to what it took to maintain. Now, in this case, this graph shows like 9 to 10 versions of the API rolled out, but so the cost rose not as sharply as the other one, but rose nevertheless. And then the third one is the compatible one API to support them all. Is that a reference to Lord of the Rings? Okay. So one API that's able to maintain a backwards compatibility. It's able to accept old and new versions. It was able to slow the growth in a much more reasonable pace, and thus is able to handle demands a lot better. Now, if we're going to talk about flexible APIs, if it may be a tip-off, what we're talking about is HATEOAS, hypermedia as the engine of application state. We are talking about REST, and we haven't talked about any toolkit specifically. I've only put up a Spring MVC point, which doesn't itself dictate anything about REST or HATEOAS. But if we're going to be discussing the concept of REST, it pays to go back to Dr. Roy Fielding, the founder thereof of REST. And somebody asked him about versioning APIs, and he said that there's no need to anticipate such world-breaking changes with a version API. That's what the host name does. If you really have a breaking change, an all-new system, that's what a new host is. That's what a new website is, if you will. I mean, that's what you're doing. On the web, nobody versions web pages. Nobody goes to Amazon/v2. Nobody deals with that. Amazon's able to make changes and updates and handle compatibility changes. We don't think about that in the guise of websites. Websites don't come with version numbers attached because they never need to, and neither should a RESTful API. A RESTful API done right is just a website for clients with a limited vocabulary. And we're going to see how Spring HATEOAS gives you the power to make these kind of flexible APIs and to be able to make these kind of adjustments. And you may be asking the question, what was so bad about deprecating APIs? Why can't we do that? And I invite you to go find this article by Amazon/Googler Steve Yagi. Some of you may be familiar with his entertaining yet very I don't know, controversial, is that the right word? Blog post. They're very entertaining and very cut to the bone, serious posts. They're very good. But he had seen a fact that in Google Cloud, they kept deprecating APIs and they were destructive to developers. And it's really invigorating, but there's a huge cost when you keep deprecating APIs. People are a lot more open and receptive to backwards compatible APIs. And one of the case in point, I'm on the Spring team, and one thing the Spring team tries to do is we try to provide a strong sense of backwards compatibility in APIs. That's a chat question or not, but I don't need this. Let's see. Okay, that's all right. Let me get back to this part. Okay. All right. So there's a link if you want to go check it out. That's fine. So I'm going to provide an example. We were showing earlier basic employee, a user that has an identifier, a name, and a role. And here, what I'm showing is an opportunity where still without getting into any toolkits or any specific technologies, just a different strategy. Here we have what I call the flexible employee. This is our new domain class that can support our flexible API. We can have the new field, first name and last name, but we can add support for the name field that was there originally. You just need to provide a getter and a setter. And for all the suffering Java has suffered, that's funny, over the years with having getter and setter built into the platform, essentially built into the language, here's an opportunity to take advantage of Java's setters and getters by creating a virtual property called name, which that'll nicely render a name field using the first name and last name data. And if somebody pipes in some data through the name field, it can split it apart and assign it. So this immediately adds backwards compatible support. And this is practicing a concept that I've learned for years in my career called, primarily I've seen it practiced in the database world, and it's called never delete a column. Never delete columns. Now, database engineers are able to go create triggers and all kinds of things to sustain old columns, but essentially anybody that's got an application that's talking to the database and they need to see a column, you don't want to break them by removing a column. And I solicit that we should adopt a similar behavior in our domain classes that support APIs. Just provide some sort of conversion to get between the old format and the new format, and you can smooth things out very nicely. This will handle new clients that can talk through the new API of first name and last name. And it also supports the old clients who have not had the chance yet or have not had the budget to be able to make the upgrades yet. And in this sense, everybody wins. So that sounds like a much more agreeable solution to me. So what else do you need if we're talking about flexible APIs? I mean, is this the end of the talk? Is this all that is? No, it's not everything needed to build a flexible API. Something else we need to look into doing is getting hypermedia controls. Now, what is that? The fact of the matter is a lot of different APIs that we all use in public space, we tend to have to go out to some kind of portal. They'll set up some sort of developer portal to tell us how to use the API. So instead of having to maintain that kind of website independent of our actual API, you could instead give somebody the contextual controls to manage the API in the API. And that's what hypermedia controls are all about. And the thing is, we even have the technology built up to handle this kind of thing. They're called media types. There's actually standardized media types to deal with hypermedia controls. We just don't seem to leverage them maybe as easily as we could. And you may not be aware of this, but this is how the web functions. People are not aware that Dr. Roy Fielding actually was involved in something like 15 different specs that drive how the internet operates. He's very familiar with HTTP verbs and media types and various other pieces of how the web operates. The reason the web succeeded is the fact that it's flexible. People were able to update things and make stuff on actions and controls. And the fact that it was so successful and came with a common client, the web browser, is the reason that everyone is building web apps today. Just because somebody updates a website doesn't mean you necessarily have to update your web browser to cope with it. Now, there have been along the way here and there breaking changes absolutely did require updates to browsers, but we're talking about things like whole new media types, like adding support for WebSockets and things like that. But essentially, somebody coded a handler for a media type of PDF or a handler for type JPEG. It's implemented one time in the browser and it handles it. So in a similar sense, to build an API and a client that can consume that API, if we use some of the similar tactics to that, we can have a much more flexible approach to things. So putting that Spring MVC route that we looked at earlier, that very simple, plain controller method up, I'm asking you to do one thing, is to migrate from that to this. Now, I'm going to walk through exactly what this is, because this looks like a whole bunch of gobbledygook code thrown at you. I realize that. But if we take it apart, it's not outrageous. So at the core of it is the same call that the previous one. In fact, if I flip back to it, you can see here, employee service.find by ID. We go to this variation. You'll notice at the top, it has the same, almost the same path. Because I have this demo code in one place, I need to give it a different URI. So it's /rest/employee/ID. We still need to look up the ID or the employee object based upon the ID, but we gather a little bit more data in order to put up a response for the client. In this case, we add a link. We add a handful of links, starting with a link pointing right to this method called a self link. It's kind of like a web API's equivalent to the this statement in Java. In Java, when you have a class, you use the this operator to self-reference the object. And in APIs, you use a self link in a similar vein. And what we're doing is essentially we have these methods. This class is called the hypermedia controller, if you didn't catch that. And this method is one. We're looking up one employee record. So Spring HATEOAS provides the link to and method on operators, and thus it will build the link for you automatically. So in this case, I'm able to use this method, point at an actual method, and then I can connect the links together. And essentially what it does is if I go update the mapping, if I change the routes while I'm developing it, I don't need to keep updating it in the code. Instead, it will pull all the information about the connection together for me. And it has some additional stuff that I'll go into in the next few slides, where not only do I link to this method, but there are related methods to this, like how do I make updates to this employee object? How do I access the aggregate root, for those of you familiar with domain-driven design? You'll notice here I have an update, so I link to an update method. The update method isn't shown on the screen here, but in a little bit, we're going to actually switch to some live code, and I can show it to you in a bit more of a dynamic fashion. And then finally, link back to the aggregate root, where I can find all employees. So essentially, what this whole thing is putting together is what in Spring HATEOAS has what's called an entity model. So you have the original data, the core data content that you're serving up, which is that find by ID response. And then you also include a set of links and what are called affordances. Affordances are things that let you act on the data. So now what you do is you get this. So we have that same data we saw earlier, the Frodo Baggins, only now we have our flexible information. We have both the original name field and we have the first name and last name. and the role data. But we also, if you look further down, we have linked data. And so this provides support. The new clients are able to consume the first name and last name stuff. The old clients can consume the data through the name field. And then we have links to be able to navigate between related components. Now, this is a bit of a contrived example, so I'm linking back to the aggregate root where I can find all employees, but you can also have conditional links like, you can find related orders. If this particular employee has expense reports that are in progress, you could dynamically add that link on here so people, the clients could navigate to their expense reports or time cards or, whatever related data is that's in the system. You can dynamically add links to do that, to navigate, and each application may consume different links based upon what it needs to do. Now, what I couldn't fit on one page is there's multiple types of hypermedia. That other format that we just saw is called HAL, or Hypermedia Application Language. There's an extension of HAL called HAL Forms that's designed to let you actually render HTML5 form structures. It actually reads the details of the property of the domain class to go generate a template. In this case, it spotted the update call was connected to a HTTP put operation. So it puts this template here with the idea that you can write some glue code and render an HTML5 form. So we can see the attributes, and it lets you affect change, basically, whether it's new or old clients. So I'm going to exit out of this screen share, I'm going to change my sharing here. And let's go over to my IDE where I actually have some of this demo code here. So this is all running. This is a Spring Boot application that I have. And there's a few more slides after this where I talk about the clients that can, like how Spring HATEOAS makes it possible for you to consume Hypermedia APIs. But right now I'm talking about the server side version of it. And so for this, I basically have a bare bones Spring Boot application. In this case, I have this annotation at the top of my app to say I want to turn on hypermedia support. And in this case, I want to turn on the built-in HAL and HAL forms types. Now, there's other hypermedia types supported, and if you visit the reference documentation, you can learn more about that. And it's even possible to go create your own media type. There's other hypermedia types that the Spring HATEOAS project doesn't directly support. But what I'm going to drill into is this is the basic employee object that we started our demonstration looking at. No, this does not have any entity annotations or JPA stuff, because for this example, we're not actually talking to a real database. But if I were talking to a database, I'd potentially mark this up with JPA or whatever data store I was using properly. And it's really a pretty basic domain object. If I look to the alternative was to have this, oh wait, I opened the wrong class. Was to have this flexible employee object that had migrated to the first name, last name thing, yet down here had the, get name. Oh, well, gee, I did not realize this one does not have the support baked in for the name field. So this flexible employee is not very flexible, and I didn't realize I'd made that mistake. But let's look to the final version here. And this one doesn't have it either. Okay, so this version of it, somehow it slipped past me, should also have get name and set name with those handlers baked in, but it doesn't. So there you have it. So that was a major flub on my part. So if we go back to the basic employee, if I go look in the underlying service, it's pretty simple. This case, I just have a basic list of objects, but this could actually be a service that interacts with the data store using something like Spring Data JPA. But it has basically repository-like operations: find all, find a single thing. You can find based on name, whatever. Now, if I go over to that hypermedia controller, we can look in a little bit closer at what we're doing here. So this was the code that we were looking at earlier, kind of by itself on a slide. So in this case here, we have a self link. Now, what all is in a link? If I just go open this up, I'm going to discover that a link is a Spring HATEOAS class, and there's really not a lot to it. There's something called a rel, or which is a link relation, which is kind of its contextual name. There's actually a pre-baked standard out there from the IANA Institute that defines several pre-made things like this is order or user or record or things like that, whatever the logical type of this thing is, if you will. And then there's the href, or which is really the URI. What is the URI of this link? Now, there's other specs I'm not going to go into that introduce other fields that you can use to really kind of lay out the details of what this link is. And if you're interested, feel free to come check out Spring HATEOAS in your spare time. But we also have the support for templates and affordances. I'm going to go back to the controller to kind of show what that is. So what we really have here at the base of this is we want to capture, in essence, I want to capture this route that's buried up here in this annotation. I mean, this is what we're after. I want this route with this particular user. If this in the demo code in the slides I showed, Frodo had ID 0. I want to capture that as /rest/employee/0, but I don't want to glue it together myself. I want to let the toolkit do it for me. And so when somebody invokes this web controller, I have this ID field and I can invoke this method. See, this thing's linking right back to it. If I use my ID and navigate to it, it takes me right back here. And I'm going to grab that method and build and ask Spring HATEOAS to build me a link. And I'm going to call that the self link. So all I've got here is basically it's a link, and that's all it is. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, so this link for this particular user or employee, I should say, is able to affect change through its update operation. That's what's called an affordance. This method affords me the ability to make changes to the user. And so I can link down here to this operation. You'll notice this is where I have the put annotation, and it's kind of got the same route to it. And this is where you can make updates to it. You can change or replace a particular entry. And so what I'm doing is I'm grabbing a handle to that. It's a type of link, but it has a certain context. And then what I'm going to do is I'm basically saying the self link is related to the update link. And so there should be, when you show somebody the self link, you should also show them in the template field, if they're using a template supported form of hypermedia, this update link. And then what other links do you want? In this case, these are all unconditional. These are getting rendered regardless of what you're doing. In this case, I want to link back to this all method, to this class's all operation. And I'm going to give it the relationship name of employees. So in a sense here, I'm returning back this core data with two links, the self link and the aggregate root link. But you have the ability to say, if, okay, if, this employee has any expense reports, then, create links to expense, take that right, expense reporting system. And you could, add those two. So I don't have that actually baked, but this is the concept here. Okay, so I have a question. There's a question. Can such an API be easily documented via Swagger? Well, yes, you could document stuff via Swagger, but Swagger is an entirely different paradigm of what you're talking about. So what Swagger does is it looks at all this data and then it renders essentially the portal server for you. It puts it into a portal, and then it's your job when you write the front end code, go read the portal, grab the URIs that are in it, roll them into, bake them into your client, and then go talk to the service. That's kind of how Swagger rolls, if you will. And And it's very flexible in the sense that, okay, I'm going to make an update. Maybe I'm going to update the route. I'm going to drop this this if clause. What if I, if I update the route, change it to whatever, and if I rerun the app, it should regenerate the HTML from Swagger. But now I need the client that's consuming that. I need to go turn the crank on the client to go consume that, to update that. I'll admit I'm not totally up to date on everything that Swagger does. I don't know if clients that consume APIs are able to dynamically, automatically consume those updates or not with Swagger. But what happens is if this API changes and I go release it, the URI itself in the hypermedia, if I go back, let me go pull that slide back up from the deck. Let me go put, okay, right here. So this link right here that's behind the arrow, /rest/employees/0, maybe you couldn't see that it wrapped around. The whole idea is that link has a name. The name is self. So anybody that's consuming this URI just says, I need the self link. Give me the self link. I don't care what the self link is. Give it to me and I'm going to navigate it to it. The concept of hypermedia is that you should not be pasting together URIs. You should not be assembling them. You should be consuming them by their logical name. You should say, give me the self link. I'm going to navigate to it. It's kind of like if you go visit Amazon.com to go purchase a book, you don't look up the ASIN number and form the URL to go to it. You type the name of the book and you get links back and you navigate through links based on the title of the book you're looking for. You don't navigate by going to a portal server, looking up a URI pattern, sticking in the ASIN number on Amazon, and then pasting that into the browser and navigating to it. Instead, you navigate by hypermedia. And so this is the API equivalent of doing that. It says, give me the self link and I'm going to navigate to it. And so whatever this is, Spring HATEOAS will dynamically update itself to render that, as long as you keep calling it the self link. If you don't change anything, then it'll work just fine. And so that's how we have, and so as I mentioned, we have the update link. And then here we have this aggregate root link, which links back to the all method up here, up top. Now, Spring HATEOAS provides us with some other convenience operations to do. For example, it's a common paradigm that if you get at the aggregate root level, that's where your post operation typically lives as well, for creating new entries behind that aggregate root. And there's a lot of patterns we tend to repeat. So Spring HATEOAS provides us with some operations. I'm going to call an assembler, and I'm going to open that up here. This is what's called a simple representation model assembler. And if you're new to the terminology, then that's kind of a mouthful to say. But basically, with Spring HATEOAS, the concept is you're putting together models. The actual resource, the REST resource, is the method. Is the methods itself. This is a Spring MVC REST controller. This is the resource. All this Spring MVC code is to respond it. But what we're building together is a set of models to model our employee domain objects here. And this is a little helper that comes with a basically, this interface provides us with the means to add links to the single item situation, where I'm just getting back a single item, whatever this generic type is, or I'm getting back a collection like in an aggregate root. And so there's an option to have links there, and the two can work together. So in this case, if I get handed a flexible employee resource record, I can go grab the self link. This looks very similar to that other code I just looked at. Build the links up, link it to its update operation, and go add that to the and also add a link back to the aggregate root. And this is for if I get a single item employee object, to go build that up. And this is in case you're having to do stuff at the aggregate root level. But the idea is essentially, with a little bit of extra effort, if I can kind of glue these different methods together, like maybe I go and add a method to go fetch those expense reports related to the employee. If I glue it together in this controller kind of one time, then I'm free to go make updates to the domain model. I can make updates to the URIs if need be, but as long as the relationships are the same, the clients shouldn't have to worry about any updates because they're going to navigate by logical concept. It's like having a set of saved hyperlinks in your browser to say, okay, I know where to go to. I'm going to go to Amazon.com and I'm going to navigate through this menu structure to go find stuff. Amazon's free to update the URIs all they want. We don't care about that because we're not physically baked into using their URIs. We just navigate by hyperlink. So what I'm going to do is I am going to switch back to the slideshow and show a little bit. Let's pick up where we left off here. Let's see. We already looked at this part. And I'm going to talk about the other side of that. So we talked a little bit about that with server-side generation, how to generate a hypermedia API. And to generate a server-side API, yes, it takes a little bit more effort, but it's not a lot of effort. And that's the whole point is with Spring HATEOAS, we make it much simpler to define these relationships between web endpoints. But what if you wanted your client to consume hypermedia? Now, in this case, I'm talking about a Java client, and more specifically, a Spring Java client. I'm not talking about JavaScript. In that case, you have to go find a JavaScript toolkit that does hypermedia, and that's not what we're talking about. At the end of the day, for those of you more familiar with the deep internals of Spring MVC, essentially we have message converters that convert between different types and things like that. And so to handle hypermedias essentially involves registering message converters. Do you want to deal with all that? I mean, as a library consumer, you really shouldn't have to deal with that. The library should help you do that for you. Are you ready to go out on the Stack Overflow to figure out how to customize either the venerable REST template or the newer web client to handle HAL forms, whatever's registered? You really shouldn't have to do that. In that case, Spring HATEOAS has you covered. So now what we're talking about here is there's a Spring HATEOAS comes with something called a Hypermedia REST Template Configurer. Maybe that's a long wordy name, but it describes what it does. It's a REST template configurer for hypermedia types. What you return back is essentially a Lambda function where you register hypermedia types, and it says to whatever hypermedia types got enabled, that enable hypermedia support annotation, this will automatically look them up and register them with whatever REST template was provided. Now, REST Template Customizer is an interface that provided by Spring Boot. It used to be back in the olden days, long ago, when we sat around campfires, Spring Boot would register a REST template instance in the application context, but they don't operate on that paradigm anymore. Instead, there's a REST template builder concept so that anytime you need another instance of REST template, you can ask for that bean, and it will give you a new copy of REST template with all of Spring Boot's auto-configured goodness applied to it. And part of that process is it goes out and looks for any REST template customizers to apply them. So this ties you into Spring Boot's ability to automatically register hypermedia support. And so if you're going to use REST template to invoke this hypermedia powered endpoint, you can do a get operation, and down at the bottom, you feed it this particular type, and it will hand you back your flexible employee domain type along with the hypermedia, like basically the links and the templates thrown in. So you're able to access that and navigate through that. So, and I had arrows to show that. But I forgot about that. And there's a counterpart equivalent if you happen to be using Web Client, which is really cool. Web Client's a Fluent API that was introduced along with Spring Web Flux. So it can act reactively. It's a little slicker. REST template. Basically, there's a lot of changes we'd like to make to REST template. REST template is very well established, so we're not really updating its API structure much. So all the new happening action is in web client. So I would encourage you to check it out if you haven't yet. But essentially, we have a counterpart configurer for web client, and it's a hypermedia web client configurer, and it operates under the same paradigm. So anytime you need to get a web client builder from Spring Boot, it will look for all of its web client customizers and apply it. And so here's the same method call, only doing it through web client's Fluent API. So client does a get call, specifies the URI. You give an accept header here of saying, hey, I want the how JSON tree back to me, and render that as a entity model type. So so you can either fetch back, basically just give me the POJO type, flexible employee, that just gives you the data values. But to get the links and the templates and all that extra hypermedia support, you wrap it with this entity model type. And one thing, by all means, do not ever put a block call into your production code. This is for demonstration purposes only, so don't do that. If we have some time, I'm just watching the clock here. If we have some time, we can look at that, or if you have other questions. But I just wanted to mention some of the other features here include, and I've been talking about Spring MVC, and I've been talking about REST template, but what I've been alluding to with web client is that we also have support in Spring Web Flux. So if you're writing reactive controllers, we have very similar APIs to do link formation in a Web Flux controller. There's other media types in the project. We have something called Über JSON, which has absolutely no relationship to Uber, the ride-sharing application. Mike Admonson, REST advocate, has actually drafted several hypermedia formats, one of them including Uber. I think it's a uniform basis for exchange. I can't remember what the R stands for, but it's another hypermedia type. And there's another format called collection JSON. And you can go you can actually roll your own. That is a request we had for 2 to 3 years, and we finally added that a couple years ago. So you can actually create your own hypermedia type if you want to, and register it with the toolkit, and it will operate with it. We have actually added support. There's a standardized JSON format for problems. Basically, if error codes, if you will, you can look it up under RFC 7807, and we have support for that. Something else is a lot of people have picked up and used it in the past 3 to 4 years since we reinstated active development on it. So we've been able to clean up some of the performance and some of the structures behind it. There's even a big improvement in community involvement. There's a third-party library for JSON API support. There's a third-party library for Siren support. Remember, Siren should be uppercased. We've made a lot of updates in the documentation, and there's new ideas coming out. So there's a lot of active development. And in fact, the most recently developer from Kai Toder, it was he runs the JSON API support, and he put out a bug fix release recently based on Spring Boot 2.5. But we actually have links to these third-party types if you go to the project site, spring.io/project/Spring HATEOAS. So be sure to go check out the project. And we also have how-tos and guides out there and stuff like that to enjoy that. So if you're wanting to learn more, if you want to get more of all this action, be sure to go check out my YouTube channel called Spring Boot Learning. And basically, it's a lot of videos about how to use Spring Boot, how to learn about Spring Boot, and also have fun while you're doing it. So give it a check out once you're done with the JCON conference. And I want to say big thanks to JCON 2021 for inviting me to come here. So if you want to keep up with what's happening on Spring HATEOAS, we have a Twitter handle @Spring HATEOAS, so you can see all these things that are getting posted. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually exit out of here, so out of my presentation mode, and see if there's more. Got time for questions and stuff. I think we have about 6 minutes. Now somebody did ask earlier about the book. If you go look, I'll go type it in here, but look for Hacking with Spring Boot 2.3 Reactive Edition and Hacking with Spring Boot 2.4 Classic Edition. Let me put that on to everybody. So you can find those both at leanpub.com, but you can also find them on Amazon and a handful of other bookstores. I have it in lots of bookstores. I believe to get the paperback, you have to go to Amazon, but it's available on Amazon.de or .com or where it's provided. But the ebook is available in a lot of other places as well. And I actually have some chapters dedicated to building hypermedia-based APIs. I don't know if we have any other questions, etc., about that, about Spring HATEOAS or whatever. Fire them away. Okay, we have a question here. What should a foreign bounded context store as a reference to a resource? The full self link of the resource, or the ID and then call what? A find by ID URI, how to navigate to it. Okay, so that's a good question, and it's generated a lot of debate. Essentially, fundamentally, what you want to store is a fully formed self link. So the fully formed self link. So when you're looking at that record of, I'm gonna stop the share so I can sit there. So if you're at a fully formed URL, when you go visit that and you get all the data, it has a link to itself, and so that's what you want to hold on to for sure. And you should not hold on to IDs and be thinking I'm gonna put this together. So instead, I may be able to share my desktop and go look at the clients that I have up here for demo. So, okay, like here's an example of, this is a client that talks to the server app that I had here. And this is that web client customizer that I showed to register hypermedia support. But down here's where it actually does the talking, okay? And here I actually have it grab a Spring Boot web client builder, it builds it, and then here it actually makes the call. And in this case, it's fetching that's a full URI that was rendered. Now, if you don't know what APIs to go to, you tend to want to start at the root of the API. Now, it could be, in this case, this is localhost, so this is demo code, but this would theoretically go to api.example.com. And at the top, it may have a lot of different aggregate roots in a giant hypermedia record. And you can say, I want to go to the employee aggregate root. So typically you would have a api.example.com/employees. And if you navigated to there, you would see a list of all of them. And you could then navigate, which one do you want? Surf to that one by link relation. And then if you find a single employee reference and you want to link back to that in the future, you grab the self link. All right. Any more questions? We still got a couple minutes, so fire away. We're going to click on the spotlight here to go put it over here. All right. Okay, so okay, here's another question. So the aggregate roots are basically the index pages where consumers start. Fundamentally, yeah, that's, if you think about it, how do I always try to, whenever I'm trying to think of hypermedia concepts, I think about, if I'm going to Amazon.com and looking for something, I go to Amazon.com and I got a search box that I can navigate, or I have a list of stuff that I can go to. So in a sense, for an API, if you go to the root of the API, it should give you index pages to go down. Now, your clients have the ability, you can cache those links, so you don't have to keep starting at the root. Clients can implement a form of caching to say, I need to start with the employees system, and I can go to there. And if you have search, if you draft some search operations for that particular aggregate root, you should register it at that level. All right, I think we're out of time here, so I appreciate everybody coming to my presentation. So I hope you go out and link some stuff together.